In a potentially historic and stunning move, Iran and Saudi Arabia appear to be moving closer to easing tensions after decades of deadly hostilities. The two longtime regional foes have waged proxy wars against each other for years across the Middle East, especially in war-torn countries like Yemen and Syria. However, top diplomats from both countries held major bilateral talks in Iraq last month. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman recently weighed in on the prospect of repairing relations with Tehran.
إيران دولة جار وكل ما نطمح له أنه يكون لدينا علاقة طيبة ومميزة مع إيران. لا نريد وضع إيران يكون صعب، بالعكس نريد إيران مزدهرة تنمو، لدينا مصالح فيها، لديهم مصالح في المملكة العربية السعودية لدفع المنطقة والعالم للنمو والازدهار. إشكاليتنا هي في التصرفات السلبية التي تقوم فيها إيران، سواء من برنامجها النووي أو دعمها لميليشيات خارجة عن القانون في بعض دول المنطقة أو برنامج صواريخها البالستية. نعمل اليوم مع شركائنا في المنطقة وفي العالم لإيجاد حلول لهذه الإشكاليات، ونتمنى أن نتجاوزها وأن تكون علاقة طيبة وإيجابية فيها منفعة للجميع.
A new article in GZero Media's Signal newsletter dives into the possibility of a Saudi-Iran friendship and how it could impact the U.S. and the entire region. And Alex Kliment wrote that article. He's the editor of GZero Media's Signal newsletter, and he joins us now. We haven't seen you practically since the start of the pandemic, my friend. So good to see you.
Yeah, what a sight for sore eyes. Lovely to be back.
Probably Anne-Marie, you mean, not me. But let me ask you, Alex, so, you know, it's interesting. Anne-Marie and I were, as we were listening to the Crown Prince, we were sort of saying to ourselves, you know, how much can we really take this at face value? I mean, these countries have been enemies, frankly, not just adversaries, but straight up enemies for a very, very long time. You know, going back to the sort of the Iranian Revolution at the very least, and even before that, some would say. So what are we to make of this notion that all of a sudden these two adversaries could possibly look at forming some kind of friendship? Sounds to me like a strong word. Perhaps diffusing tensions is accurate.
I think that's right. Yeah, I mean, look, these are two countries that for 40 years have been the bitterest. It's hard to think of a regional rivalry anywhere in the world that has been as bitter or destructive as that which exists between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But you heard what the Crown Prince said. I would note, actually, that 3 years ago, Crown Prince Salman said of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei that he was a fellow who made Hitler look good. So to go from that to maybe we can be friends is quite a change in 3 years. And I think, you know, a lot of the change of heart that's happened in Riyadh and in Tehran has to do with the change of government that happened in Washington, right? Particularly from the Saudi perspective, the Trump administration was immensely supportive of the Saudis, supported their war in Yemen, looked the other way when Saudi officials murdered the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. And of course, the Trump administration walked out of the Iran nuclear deal, which is something that the Saudis had always fervently opposed. Biden has come in and reversed a lot of that. He's cut support for Saudi's war in Yemen. He's given the Saudis a little bit of grief about human rights. But most importantly, he's launched this full-bore diplomatic effort to revive the Iran nuclear deal. So when you take that together with a broader aim that the Biden administration has set of reducing the U.S. presence in the Middle East, the Saudis are suddenly looking around saying, well, you know, it's a dangerous world, it's a dangerous region, and our main backer, our main ally is suddenly a little less interested in giving us that kind of full-throated backing. So I think the Saudis are trying to explore a way to reach a more durable or predictable modus vivendi with their prime rival in the region in a world where they may not have the support of as much support from their primary ally. The Iranians, from their perspective, I mean, they would love to get back into the Iranian nuclear deal. They would love to see the sanctions come off. They would love to normalize economic ties with more of the Middle East, more of the Arab world. And I think they probably see smoothing over relations with Saudi as an important way to mollify Saudi resistance to a new Iran nuclear deal between the U.S. and Iran and the other parties to the deal. So I think both sides are looking at what's happening in Washington, looking at what's happening in the region and saying, hey, this might be a moment to try to paper over some of these differences.
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting watching the Biden administration. You remember candidate Biden said he was going to make a pariah out of Saudi Arabia. But then when he became President Biden, I think he sort of softened a little. And you're right that he announced, the U.S. is pulling back support for Saudi Arabia with the conflict in Yemen, sort of partially, but not 100%, only when it came to offensive actions by Saudi Arabia. So I see these sort of baby steps, but I guess in this region, even baby steps are a huge deal. We know, as you mentioned, that President Biden is looking to revive the Iran nuclear deal negotiations. Tell me how a rekindling of a relationship between these two countries will help Biden with those negotiations, the Iran nuclear negotiations, or the U.S. in the region in general.
Well, look, the two main opponents to the Iran nuclear deal were Saudi Arabia and Israel. The relationship between Iran and Israel is not one that can be easily or potentially ever repaired, right? But a better relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned, could help mollify some of the Saudi opposition to the Iran nuclear deal. I think there's another issue here as well, which is that there's a financial and economic incentive for both the Saudis and particularly the Iranians to reach some kind of accord. Regional rivalries and sectarian hate are really expensive. Nobody knows exactly how much money the Iranians spend on proxies and friendly governments around the region, but it's estimated to be around $15 billion a year. That is not nothing for an economy that has been absolutely crippled by sanctions. Iran's leaders know that, and the Iranian people know that as well. If you remember, in 2018, there were massive protests in Iran, primarily about corruption and inequality and lack of jobs. But a significant number of the protesters were also angry about the fact that Iran was spending money on foreign proxies rather than domestic needs. So from the Iranian perspective, if they could normalize ties with Saudi Arabia a little bit, take some of the heat out of these proxy wars that they've been spending billions of dollars on every year, that would be a good thing. The Saudis as well. Look, the Saudis are trying to diversify their economy. They want to spend more money on education and creating jobs and less money on defense. In fact, their defense budget has been slowly creeping down over the past couple of years. And again, some kind of more, I wouldn't want to say normalized or peaceful ties with Iran, but taking some of the temperature out of that would enable the Saudis to spend less money on weapons as well. As I said, rivalries are expensive, and both of these countries would like to spend money on other things.
So, Alex, would any of this have to do with what's going on right now between Israel and Gaza? It's interesting that I know that Hamas has, in recent days, publicized the fact that they've been having discussions with Tehran and also with Istanbul. And the question I have is, they perhaps see it, if Iran and Saudi Arabia do become more closely aligned, that might actually give them a little bit of daylight, a little bit of more support for their situation. But I wonder, because we haven't seen a lot of, in years previous, you would get very strong denunciations about what is happening between the Israelis and the Palestinians from a wide range of countries, including some of these Gulf states that are now that have signed treaties and have eased tensions with Jerusalem. But we're not seeing that. So I wonder what you make of that. Do you expect? I should say Tel Aviv. But do you suspect that this will in any way ease what we've been seeing between Israel and Hamas, or not going to matter at all?
I would see the Israel-Hamas, Israel-Palestine situation as somewhat separate from the Iran-Saudi talks. That's primarily, I would say that's more about the implacable enmity between Iran and Israel, right? Of course, as you mentioned, Iran has long supported Hamas, and that's one of the many bones of contention between Israel and Iran. You mentioned the other Arab countries. Israel has successfully removed many of the other Arab governments. I would say at the popular level, there's still a lot of concern about Palestine in the Arab countries, but the main Arab governments have really kind of moved on in a way. have looked to normalize or at least improve ties with Israel as a result of the idea that Iran is a main challenge in the region. So I think the issue that's going on right now in Gaza and in Israel is much more primarily about domestic Israel-Palestine issues. Secondarily, there's an Iran-Israel angle, but the Saudi-Iran thing I think is somewhat separate.
All right, Alex Kliment, really good seeing you after such a long time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys.